was just a coming from the cold. Coming from the cold. Ooh, coming from the cold. We really thought we had a purpose. We were so anxious to achieve. We had hope, the world had promise for a slave to liberty. Freely I slaved away for something better, and I was bought and sold. And all I ever wanted was just to come in from the cold. Coming from the cold. Please come in. Coming from the cold. I feel your legs under the table, leaning into mine. I feel renewed.
Okay, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Mark Lubell. I'm the Executive Director of the International Center for Photography. And it's so moving to see so many people from the photographic community coming out tonight to really support Jay and his life. I know Jay is with us, and I know he's looking in on this community, and I know he feels all of you as you feel him. So I want to thank you again for coming. I'm going to tell you a little bit of Jay's life, and then we're going to have a few people come up and speak a bit more. And then we might just throw it out to the audience, because I know a lot of you have a lot to say about Jay. Jay was born as Harold J. Manis in Wisconsin, 1946. His parents, Betty and Art, were immigrants from Poland and Russia. Most of their family was killed during the Nazis' invasion, and those who survived escaped to Cuba and to a small town of Wisconsin, where a tiny enclave of Jews settled. Jay graduated from the University of Wisconsin in Madison and received a master's in photography at the Visual Studies Workshop in Rochester. He worked as a commercial photographer for many years, but he found his true comfort in the streets and clubs in the East Village in the 70s and 80s. His home was 3rd Street in the East Village besides the Hells Angels headquarters for 44 years until he met and married his wife, Allison Morley, in 2011. Jay was a traveler. He traveled to 25 countries and 25 different states, but as many of you know, Peru was really his second home. And now a bit of background on Jay as a photographer. In 1970, he landed at the Center of the Eye in Colorado in an early photo workshop where he assisted in the program. While hitchhiking his way to Chicago, he was picked up by a few people, Robert Frank and June Leaf, who would ever change his life. During the long car ride, Jay became convinced that he was indeed destined to be a photographer. Robert and June were driving to the Visual Studies Workshop run by Nathan Lyons. And as many of you know, Nathan was a huge inspiration to Cornell Kappa and a driver behind ICP. Jay enrolled in the program and graduated in 1973. His lifelong friendship with Robert Frank and June Leaf sustained his belief in old-school darkroom habits. Jay taught black and white photography here at ICP for the last 10 years and at ICP and at SVA for over 30 years. He also taught internationally, along with Allison, in Bangladesh, Lima, Bogota, and lastly in Torino, Italy. Jay was in his East Village apartment on 9/11 and photographed a couple watching the destruction from the rooftop. This picture went on to become a poster for Heroes New York. And this is really where I met Jay, as I was involved with Heroes New York. And as I tell many people, that experience changed many of our lives forever. And that exhibition went on to become the second most seen exhibition in the history of the medium. So Jay's images in that exhibition were featured and went all over the world. Jay's best friend was a dog he found abandoned in Tompkins Square Park, who he fitly named Millimeter. He leaves his third dog, Rolleiflex, and his wife, Allison Morley, as well as his sister, Dolly Becker-Stein, who's here today, and his brother, Robert Manis, who's also with us, as well as their children and grandchildren, and many cousins who are here with us tonight. So once again, I'd like to thank you so much for coming out. This really is a celebration of Jay's life and really a celebration of the community in New York, which all of you are part of.
I met Jay through Bill, who was an instructor at the new school where I landed straight from Moscow in mid-90s. I wanted to improve my English, and Bill worked at ESL department of the new school. Bill was petrified that I was here all alone, no family, no friends, and he immediately adopted me by providing advice on spelling, grammar, and how-tos of using New York City deli salad bars. Bottom line, don't. Few months later, Bill called me and said, "Listen, I'm about to have a baby, so I don't have time for you. But I have a friend, Jay. He's going to be your New York uncle now." Somehow, the thoughtfulness of this gesture surpassed its weirdness. So 3 days later, I was on my way to Jaffa Cafe to meet Jay. We met at Jaffa Cafe at St. Mark's, where amidst dusty chandeliers and red shades, lamps, we had our first out of few hundred breakfasts. Him, eggs and bacon. Me, cheese blintzes with a side of bacon. We knew it was a friendship made in heaven. Jay was there for me even when he was not physically present in my life. He was like my family, which meant that it was only normal not to hear from him for weeks and then get a call on Friday afternoon. "I'm going to some boring Shabbat party of some friends I don't like so much. Want to come along?" "Sure, sounds like fun." One day, I needed to move from my first room in New York, shared with semi-friendly, semi-crazy artist Pat, to another spot in the room in the apartment shared with always stoned jazz musician Sam and Barbara Streisand's camera assistant Dan, whose girlfriend always gave me a stink eye. "Don't worry, Deborah, I don't want your fat boyfriend. He doesn't even wash dishes." Jay offered to help move using his old Russian model car, which he always parked on the street because, as he said, "I pay approximately the same in car tickets as I would for garage, so why bother?" It snowed the morning of the big move, and Jay stunned me, a Moscow kid, with admission that he did not own a shovel to dig out his vehicle. He got a little grumpy as I kept bringing out my boxes full of school papers and sweaters. I just discovered the $10 store. I needed those acrylic sweaters in electric colors. But in 2 hours, I was moved, and boxes were all brought up by hand to the 5th floor walk up, and the 2nd Avenue Deli matzo ball soup was consumed. No bacon. Jay always came through, no matter the weather or the number of itchy sweaters, like any uncle would. Jay allowed me to sublet his studio apartment, previously used as a dark room, for 3 months when I just got my immigration status worked out. It was my very first personal space in New York City, with that sacred path from the bed through the kitchen to the bathroom. I didn't even have to fully dress. When I showed up the day of the big move, Jay showed up on the door, his hair all spiked up. "Is it today?" "Yes, Jay, it is today." It was easy to confuse his occasional grumpiness with unfriendliness, but his actions were the ones that spoke much louder than words. Hours later, I had my own personal New York haven for the next 3 months after crazy roommates with their stink-eye girlfriends before embarking on my next intense adventure as an immigrant. It was a relief I really needed, and family came through like Jay always did. As he did for so many of you, I'm sure, sitting in this room, friends, colleagues, students. Many years later, in touch, out of touch, in touch again, when I turned my life to music and art again, after I did what I have to do as an immigrant, after a long break, Jay was there to support me. I was a little hesitant, but I enrolled in his darkroom class at ICP, which really provided as a start of kind of awakening my creativity again. I was a little nervous. Will our friendship be in the way? Will it be a little weird? You know, they say don't do business with friends. But you know, it only is true if you suck at what you do. And Jay did not suck as a teacher. He was the most amazing, generous, inspiring teacher I've ever had, and the most kind one. And I do know how to mix those chemicals now. Below is some of our correspondence through the years. His letters, his emails, always wonderful and wondrous, to the point, at times all mixed up. They arrive in an email like a package. They're full of words, sometimes out of order, like a puzzle you have to collect. But once you do, they always make you smile. 2/24/16, my birthday. Subject, a good day, email. A young Russian girl comes to the big city, it becomes her city, and she has a great adventure. It's a good story. My dear, from Jay, yours first New York friend. Hello, hello. 1/29/16, subject, slow reply, email. Very slow, but always close in thought. Perhaps when we finally missed in West Village for, you know what, he means bacon. You may visit our co-op, which will eventually be perfect for your children when they go to NYU or Columbia or run away from home. My best wishes for you, my dear. Hello, hello. January 1st, subject, no subject, message. I'm sitting in an airplane at JFK getting ready to fly away to the Caribbean until 1:18, so you need to sing really loud for me to hear you while I'm lying on the beach in my teeny Speedo. So sorry. I would gladly trade sun and blue sky for the opportunity to watch you perform. Next time, Uncle Jay. 4/1/10, subject, sort of great it was, message. Substitute teaching, AKA babysitting, a class at my other school. Not nearly as interesting as your class. I'm so bored. I'm happy to think about bacon. Thank you. Hello, hello. 5/13/08, subject, ICP open house, message. Good. I was hoping I didn't have to wait too many years to see you again. Like many activities, I can give an answer now of definitely, probably, or certainly maybe. More information to come. Hello, hello, Jay. Subject, voice from the past, message. Hello, hello, I'm thrilled to receive your note and email and lovely photographs. One seems perilously close to being a piece of art. I'm guilty, of course, for being a little slow to respond. When I travel, I forget every responsibility and adult task that is so easy to leave behind, will be waiting and demanding immediate attention upon return. I've been busy this last several days. I am lazy, but maybe, I repeat, I'm really happy to hear from you. Subject, voice from the past, message. Wow, master student of New York City and American idiosyncrasy. Much change, much the same. Everything is amazing. I'm writing to you from Bangladesh, 3 exclamation marks, where I'm teaching a photo workshop with my wife, 8 exclamation marks. Allison, to Australian college students and Bengali photojournalists, I want to know everything. How terrific to hear from you. Love and wonder. Hello, hello, Jay. I know that today we're gonna remember Jay's life, but also celebrate him and how much he did for all of us. I know he did for me, and how much he impacted my life. I did not grow up with God or prayer, but I do know that actions do make one live forever, as long as the people whose lives are impacted continue living. As if I was not petrified enough, Allison asked me to sing, which I'll do for Jay and for Allison, who I know he loves so much. It's a Russian song, which has the meaning of the very thought that I tried to express, which is that we do continue living in the memories of those around us, like a flower that buds from the tree branch, trying to hug the sun, and like a grass that grows through the earth. So, я к вам травою прорасту, попробую к вам дотянуться, как почка тянется к листу, вся в ожидании проснуться, однажды утром зацвести, пока ее никто не видит, а уж на ней роса.
Jay blew into New York from the Midwest via the Visual Studies Workshop in Rochester in the mid-'70s. I met him through my neighbor, Robert Frank. And Jay met Robert while working on a student film there. He sublet my loft a few times while I traveled and quickly became one of the Bleecker Street irregulars. Meetings held whenever Robert, Frank, or June Leaf had an opening. Jay settled into East 3rd Street and became part of the Lower East Side. If your bike was stolen, Jay knew where to go on Avenue C to buy it back. Once, when his car was stolen from 3rd Street, he managed to chase it down and find it a few blocks away. We always had old beat-up cars, and when you needed to get your car inspected, Jay knew the right gas station on the Lower East Side where a few bucks would get you an inspection sticker. He also had a knack of showing up in places. He managed to get into Madison Square Garden when the Rolling Stones were playing and got a great shot of Robert filming the Stones. He also had a great knack of showing up at unexpected places. In the late 70s, I was working in Telluride, Colorado, and one day Jay showed up unannounced driving a Volvo P1800 with a girl in the passenger seat, and then he was gone. In November 2001, I was at a guest house in Peshawar, Pakistan, waiting to go to Afghanistan, and watching CNN, and there was Jay on the screen talking about Here is New York. Jay and women. I would say that until I introduced Allison and Jay got usually the short end of the deal. Over the years, we shared Dylan, dark rooms, and despair. But Jay always had a smile and was upbeat and looked for the bright side. In an ever-changing world, Jay was a reliable constant. I think of him often and miss his presence and spirit on the streets of New York.
I met Jay in 1973 at the Visual Studies Workshop, back when it was still on Alton Street in Rochester. Jay had finished his thesis the spring before, and he was teaching nearby in Naples, New York. There were sort of two overlapping things going on at VSW back then, for those of you interested in the history of the place. There were the very earnest young men, and a very few women, literally sitting at Nathan Lyon's feet, listening to difficult theory. And then elsewhere in the building, there was Joan Lyon's domain, and that physical, industrial making of what we all thought was inventive new forms. On that side, there were visitors like Keith Smith and Syl LeBreau and John Wood. For me, the most important people were Bobby Bessold and Jay Manis, both of whom demonstrated to me that art could be witty and playful and smart and inventive. Every outing with Jay back then was an adventure in discovering hidden juxtapositions and absurd connections. He had a verbal wit in his early photographs, using letter forms and text and layering and mirroring. He was filled with nervous energy and anxious potential, as we all were. He was also, and as ever, extremely humble. One of my fondest memories of Jay in the early 70s was a visit he paid while my dog was giving birth. Don't ask. Only one puppy came out and the next one got stuck. Jay put the tiny, lonely newborn puppy inside his shirt and held it there while we drove a long way to the veterinarian. He held it close to him until the rest of the puppies were delivered. This memory image kind of sums up an aspect of Jay for me, and I'm sure for all of you. After Jay moved to New York, I would occasionally visit, and what I found most remarkable was that while walking in any and every neighborhood, he would inevitably run into someone he knew. How did he know so many people? When I moved here, I even ran into him several times in unexpected places. Once, I can picture it, he was just leaning against his car, wearing a little pork pie hat, the sun shining on his face, chatting with a group of people, and grinning when he saw me. Jay was a flaneur of New York back then, strolling around with a succession of his little black dogs. He really loved the city. In the 90s, I went with Jay to a visual studies workshop reunion. While I was a little uncomfortable about stepping back into that former life, Jay was totally in his element. He loved reunions, whether in Madison or Fond du Lac or Rochester. He was extremely sentimental and nostalgic about his past. Jay and I remained friends for 45 years, though there were years we didn't see each other. I saw him go through ups and downs, new loves and painful heartbreaks, teaching and traveling around the world, which got him excited about photography again. And then finding Allison seemed like the best thing that ever happened to him. When they got married, he seemed more settled and happy than I had ever seen him. But Jay also had demons that I think most of us here didn't understand. I regret that I wasn't a better friend to him in that regard, that I couldn't help that part of him that had so much self-doubt. I will miss Jay very, very much, and I have to admit to you that since his death, I have felt more than a little angry at him for leaving us too soon and depriving us of his incredible sweetness. If any of you here are feeling a little mad at him for leaving us, just try picturing him cradling that newborn puppy and it might help you get over it. Thank you.
I thought I'd share some things with you. A lot of folks have talked about Jay, knowing him professionally. I've got quite a few memories of Jay from when I was a kid and growing up, which I think sort of encapsulate his life. He lived far away from us when we were growing up. We lived in Milwaukee, and by this time he had already moved to New York. However, he still was ever present in our lives. And so I thought I'd share just some memories from that. I absolutely idolized him as a kid and also as an adult in a different way. And like for a lot of you, I imagine it's very odd for me to be in this city without Jay being here. But Jay and I managed to cross paths no matter which city I lived in, whether it was Milwaukee or Madison, Wisconsin, or Chicago or Denver. Somehow Jay always made his way through, and we always met up and did great things together. But my earliest memories of Jay, of course, are from Fond du Lac, Wisconsin. And from the beginning, my Uncle Harold, Jay, was always larger than life to me. This was partially because, as an adult, he literally seemed giant when I was a kid. He was taller than any adult in our family, and we do not come from a family of tall people. So he seemed huge to me. I thought for sure he had to be well over 6 feet tall. You know. And so, but part of that was also probably the fact that Jay had a big presence to him. A gentle presence, but a big presence for me. And you know, I just thought he was the coolest. I mean, he was my uncle that lived in New York, and not just New York, but New York City, and not just New York City, but he lived in the Village, right? Which, even as a kid, I knew that this meant something. And so I was just thrilled every time I got to see him, right? And every time that he visited, and he would bring us just the coolest things, right? Some of them were just like these little Chinese finger trap things, like, I don't know who brings that to a kid. I don't know, you know, where he picked them up, but he never came to our house empty-handed. Sometimes it would be like wooden slingshots or little rockets that you could launch if you attached them to a hose or something. But he always showed up with something for us. And so, you know, that we just love that. But one of my earliest memories of Jay actually involved learning how to spell the state of Wisconsin. When I was a kid, I often visited my grandparents in Fond du Lac in the summer, right? I summered in Fond du Lac like you do. And I loved it, and I loved it especially when Uncle Harold would come to visit. And so one summer he was visiting, and usually when he visited, I liked to hang out with him, which really just equated to me driving around with him a lot, visiting people and doing whatever he was doing, wherever he was going. But I loved it. And I remember one time riding in a car with him. I don't remember if it was his car or somebody else. And it seems like cars are a theme in Jay's life. But there was a bumper sticker on this car, not on the car, like on the bumper, but on the glove box inside of the car. And I was sitting in the front seat. I was probably 6 or 7 years old, obviously before airbags and car seats. But I was reading the bumper sticker, and the bumper sticker said, as I was sounding it out, "Escape to sin." And so I just kind of looked at him, and he said, yeah. And he explained it to me. He said, well, if you take out the Wisco part, right, it's an old famous bumper sticker that said, "Escape to Wisconsin." Said, if you just take out the Wisco part, it says, "Escape to sin." And I thought, yeah, okay, that makes sense. But that is how I learned how to spell Wisconsin. And I remembered this little conversation and this little trip every time I had to take one of those tests when I was a kid where you filled out the map of the blank states and you had to identify them. I might not have spelled them right, but I knew how to spell Wisconsin because of that. And in an odd kind of fortuitous way, when I graduated from the University of Wisconsin in Madison, got my diploma and I was reading it, and they'd spelled Wisconsin wrong. They spelled it Wisconsen, right? And I just thought, you know, and sure enough, they did recall it like a week later. And sure, I just thought, well, if they'd had that bumper sticker, this wouldn't have happened. Right? So Jay, yeah, a lot of fond memories of Jay from when I was a kid, when I was in Fond du Lac. One of my favorite parts of being in Fond du Lac and my grandparents' house was rummaging through their cabinets and their closets and these big shelves that they had in the basement, which they still had a lot of stuff from my mom and my uncles when they were kids, right? And so this was amazing to me, and it was like finding a treasure trove, and it occupied me for hours on end just digging through all of this stuff. But I loved finding Jay's stuff because to me he had the coolest stuff that I loved to play with, and I think it was because they were Jay's things, right? So his old collection of marbles that I found, they were in a box in a brown paper bag, and they had the old steel shooter marbles and the tiger eyes and just the clear glass ones, his old army men, a couple of old pocket knives that I actually still have and use from time to time. He had an old Hopalong Cassidy mug that I just absolutely, it was my favorite mug to have my orange juice out of every morning at Grandma's house. Collection of old science fiction books that I read every summer that I was there, along with some Hardy Boys and some Nancy Drew. I don't think the Nancy Drew was his, but it's on my reading list. And of course, his huge collection of baseball cards. And to me, that really was the ultimate find, because at the time, not only was I a baseball fanatic, but I had my own collection of cards going, and to have these cards that I knew Jay had put together was just something. And I was lucky enough, he let me hang on to them for a few years, and I looked at these things pretty often, and I spent a lot of time organizing them and reorganizing them, categorizing them in various ways, and I understand the connection because I still have my collection of cards, and I think of Jay every time I look at my cards, and I still reorganize them from time to time. And so that was a big deal to me, just all of those players that I knew and had read about and had meant so much to him as well. As I got older, I really became aware of Jay's connection to culture and art, and the kind of culture that he consumed or the kind of culture that he didn't want to consume. And I remember being in maybe the 3rd or 4th grade, and he was either visiting us or babysitting us, I don't know which, but it was about 11 o'clock at night, and I was up watching Saturday Night Live with him. And I'd never seen it before, and he said, no, you gotta watch this show, you'll love it. And I did, and I remember some of the skits, and then I was gonna go to sleep, and he said, no, you gotta watch this, the band's gonna be on next, and he's like, this is the best band in the world, you're gonna love it. It was Rolling Stones. And he was right, I did. I grew up loving the Stones. I bought my first Stones album with him in mind, and that little scenario in mind, somewhere around my sophomore or junior year in high school. So as I got older again, I started coming to New York to visit, and my memories with Jay in New York definitely revolve around food, eating food, finding food, all kinds of food. Walking down the street with him, and as everybody has mentioned, it seemed like he pretty much knew everyone. No matter where we were, Jay always knew someone, and they had stories. I remember going camera shopping with Jay. He bought me my first real camera. We were in the Hasidic neighborhoods doing a lot of haggling in and out of stores, but it was, I still have it. It's a little Pentax point and shoot automatic. SBO 35 millimeter. I'm not a camera person, but I still have it, and it still works. And last night I was reminded again, as I was reminiscing with my brother Michael, Mike was talking about Jay took him to see Blue Man Group a very long time ago when they were on an off-Broadway place. And it reminded me of the times Jay would take us, or when I would come to visit, to see these quirky little shows. One of them was Penn and Teller, and he said, it's this new kind of magic show. There were barely any people in the audience, but I loved it. And again, another fortuitous moment. I currently live in Las Vegas, where Penn and Teller has been playing nonstop for the last decade or so, and I never knew that I would live in a city where I would run into these guys kind of regularly in the coffee shops or on campus or at a local event. So I feel a little bit of a connection to them. One of my last trips to New York, and then I'll wrap this up, but the last time I really got to hang out with Jay was a couple of years ago, and again, Jay and I had gotten something to eat, and we were walking home, we were walking down the street, and we came upon someone who was having a sort of New York City-style yard sale on their front steps, and somebody that he knew. And I was looking at things, and she had these cool little kind of old ceramic, painted, vintage cat food bowls, and I thought, I really like those. And she said, well, those aren't for sale. So I moved on while Jay was talking to his friend, and when he caught up with me, he had these 2 little bowls. And he said, here, I talked her into, here, take the bowls. I still have the bowls. The cat ate out of those for quite some time. But afterwards, we went over to, he wanted to go check his mail over at the 3rd Street Apartments, and he did. And when we were done with that, we went up on the roof, and it had been a very long time since 9/11 at this point, but he gave me a little tour, and he talked about 9/11, and he talked about what he saw and where he was taking pictures from, and we hung up out there for a bit. And then made our way back over to his and Allison's place, and where we were got back, and Jay realized that he had lost his phone, and we spent a pretty good chunk of time in a mad search for Jay's phone, all over, and it turned out it was in the kitchen. And after we found the phone, Allison had made this amazing peach cake, and we were sitting on the couch eating the peach cake. And we were just chatting, and I looked over, and I thought I saw this little clump of dust or something on the ground, and as I looked closer, it was a little mouse, a deceased little mouse. And I just thought, well, do I say something? Do I not say something? So I finally pointed out the mouse, and they just both looked at me, sort of surprised, but sort of very nonplussed about the situation, and said, oh, okay. So we disposed of the mouse and continued eating our cake, and continued talking about just current events and art in the world and everything that was going on. And it was just, there was an absurdity to the situation, but it was just so how it was. So I was thinking about all of this, and it's just interesting the way that, when you're a kid, whether you realize it or not, people influence you in different ways. And I still think of Jay. I have this kind of flying winged goddess that he brought me back from Bali many, many years ago. It hangs over my desk. And just underneath it is a picture of my grandmother and her sister, Helen, that he had sent me on a postcard many, many years ago. And I framed that postcard. And those two things have been sitting on my desk and over my desk for at least the past 12 or 15 years. And so pretty much every day they're just in my life, and Jay's presence is in my life like that. And so thank you for letting me share my memories and my stories of Jay. His humor, his wit, his sense of humor, his sense of irony, his penchant for art, for culture, or anti-culture sometimes, the ways to frame it, and his love for animals, his family, and for place. These are all things that remain with us and with me, and so I hope Jay is happy, and cheers as we move forward. So, thank you.
My name is Jay Manis. On September 11th, I was listening to the news on the radio. I heard a report of a plane hitting the World Trade Center. I immediately put on the television. I saw, in fact, that one of the buildings was burning. I ran up to my roof. I lived on the 5th floor of a 6th-floor apartment building in the East Village. Instantly, I knew that the world had changed. I was witnessing something that throughout history people in one form or another witnessed, but in my lifetime to see something so assuredly significant, how an enormous civilization can suddenly change, how things in the world that seem so permanent, so much a part of our way of understanding the world, are destructible, can change in the blink of an eye. I mean, the blink of an eye sometimes can take decades. And I began to get the question, what does this mean? What do I do with my life? I tried to figure out what to do. I mean, I'm not a rescue worker. I'm not a medical person. I'm a photographer. And it felt like so powerless. I did not want to go down to the side. I first had this impulse, well, maybe I should go down, and see what it looks like. I didn't want to be a photographer. I was more than a photographer that morning. I was someone witnessing a primal life process, creation, destruction. The only thing I could think of doing was to go to my lab, my darkroom, and process these few pictures I shot on the roof. I mean, sometimes, it seems like to me, if I could look at something carefully enough, when you see this image, when you see the track of the light at the level of grains, maybe I can somehow change the reality of what happened. Of course, that's impossible. That didn't happen. I think there's a very strong tendency to people to forget and to deny. And I didn't want to forget what I felt that day. I showed my pictures to a few people, that seemed to be somehow part of my process of sharing the event. I sent out pictures to friends who lived in other places and so forth. And I heard about the show, Here's New York, and it seemed so perfect. I walked in and instantly I had a sense of how right this was. There was this tiny niche that I found where I could contribute something.
I'm not sure that Jay was at Prince Street before we opened when we decided to name our 9/11 photo project after a little book that E.B. White had written in the late 1940s called Here is New York. But I vividly remember him coming to the storefront not long afterwards with a copy of White's book. A first edition published in 1949 by the Book of the Month Club, with its original dust jacket and a plastic protective cover, which Jay had found on eBay for $15 or so. White's little book is basically a Valentine to the city, and this is a very Jay object. The black and white photo on its cover of Midtown Manhattan in the late 30s or early 40s, the other photos and little drawings inside, and especially all of the quirky stories that White tells about the city and its history, in his descriptions of bars and restaurants and jazz clubs and street signs and dogs and all kinds of New York City characters, famous and not famous, that you could see every day walking down the street in the late 1940s, the likes of which you could still see in the 70s and the 80s when Jay was a young man here, when so many of us were young here, when the city was a much grittier place. Jay beamed when he showed it to me, and I immediately stood it up on the table in the rear of the storefront in homage, sort of like a little altar. With nothing protecting it, since although it was 50 years old and a first edition of sorts, it wasn't rare or valuable, and anyway, everyone in the storefront in those days was totally courteous and respectful. This copy, this first edition published in 1949 by the Book of the Month Club, with its original dust jacket and its plastic protective cover, is actually not the one that Jay bought, since that one was stolen a few months later. Or maybe it is. Maybe this copy that I bought on 9/11 this year for $15 on eBay as I was thinking about Jay and the project is actually the same one Jay bought. And the thief waited 17 years to put it up for sale once the coast was clear. That once he figured that the statute of limitations for stealing or shoplifting had finally expired. In any event, when I noticed that the book had been lifted, I went over to Jay, and figuring he was going to be upset, I said, "Jay, I'm really sorry. That really sucks." And he replied in that shy, sly, wry tone of his. I can't do his voice, I don't do voices, but "Michael, yes it does." He thought for a moment, and then he added, "But maybe it's a good thing." "A good thing? How's that?" I said. "Well, maybe the fact that it got stolen is a sign that the city is getting back to normal." That somebody stealing a book could be a good thing is very Jay. He was positive about almost everything that year we all worked together, even if he could also be vulnerable and a bit fragile and need reassurance, as we all did, as everybody did. He was always looking for the good in people, and he was always finding it. Looking and being open to what he saw, being open to people, was a central element in his personality and his character, and also obviously key to his being such a terrific photographer and such a terrific teacher. Along with Charlie Traub, Maggie Berquist, and a number of others, he was a mainstay of the intake desk in the storefront, meeting with the photographers who came in and deciding which of their pictures we were going to take. I manned the desk alongside him sometimes, and I remember him standing up and shaking hands a little formally and also a little ironically with each photographer when their turn came up as they stood in line in front of the table. It was sort of like a citizens' committee during the American Revolution, or maybe even the French Revolution and the Russian Revolution for the first 15 seconds before everything really went south. Then sitting down, Jay would look at their prints and their contact sheets and listen to them as they recounted what they had seen and experienced, which was a big part of the process. Never rushing them and always being positive. Hey, I really like this. I really like the way you framed this one. Wow, we don't have any pictures at all like this of a dog wearing sunglasses in a boat in the harbor with the towers in the background. Before the project opened, and then as it grew, I strung up the wires in the storefront on which we hung all the pictures. And I hung the first few hundred of them, but Jay was one of the ones who took charge thereafter of hanging the new images as they were printed throughout the day. And like everything he did, he approached this very carefully and studiously. I didn't think there should be any order to the pictures, any curation, just that no two similar pictures would be hung next to each other. But Jay would look not just for a blank space to wedge a new one in, as I did, but for a place where it would make a little story with its neighbors or set off a little spark, a low-key one, nothing too loud or obvious. There was nothing loud or obvious about Jay. I learned a lot about looking at pictures from him by looking at pictures with him. And I learned a lot from him about photography, as I did from just about everybody else back then, since I was not in photography professionally at the time. But if the pictures were more about people than about buildings, the project was really more about people than about pictures. It was about community and about our city and our country and our families. We were a family, and Jay was a central part of it. We're still a family, even if we don't see one another as often as we should, and it shouldn't take a sad occasion like this one to get us together. And Jay is still very much a part of that family and always will be. This seems a good place for me to read a comment sent by Andrea Starr-Reese, who was one of Jay's friends and students, who's now working in Indonesia and would very much like to have been here. Jay was the kindest of kind men. When I first met Jay, he was sitting at a table looking at some of the various 9/11 photographs that were under consideration for the Here is New York collection. At that time, everyone dropping in to show what they shot was still carrying some degree of PTSD. Jay made all feel welcome, comfortable, and appreciated, but that was Jay. He was instantly inclusive, within moments, a friend. I still don't know how he did that, and I don't know how to adequately describe the impact of the quiet warmth of his presence. Allison, I am so very deeply sorry that he is gone. We are all deeply sorry that he is gone. That year we all spent together on Prince Street and in Chicago and in Arl and uptown by ICP. That year we all spent together with Jay was one of the hardest years of our lives, and also, speaking for myself and I'm sure for everybody, one of the most rewarding and the most meaningful. It was meaningful because of the connections we made and the people we met and the lives we touched, and Jay touched all of our lives deeply. 17 years later, when the city has changed so much, when so many of the old bars and clubs and little shops and neighborhood spots that White talks about and that Jay frequented have closed, when people still steal books and when terrorism is still a problem, but hardly the biggest problem we have to deal with in this country, we need to keep in mind how we were during those times, what brought us together, and how we looked at things. We remember, we honor, and we love Jay, his modesty and his kindness and his dedication and his empathy and his openness and his clarity of vision and his love. 9/11 brought out the best in us. We did our best. Jay was the best. Thank you.
So first of all, I want to thank everyone for coming. You're great, and it's cold and nasty, and 3 months to the day later that Jay died. I want to mention one thing, which is I want to thank all the people who helped me pack all the little seed packets that I hope you take when you leave. Jay loved sunflowers, and he photographed himself in fields of sunflowers many times over his life. Keith's, Betsy's house in upstate in Ankrum, and Janet found a picture up near Rochester. And So that's on the packet, and there's seeds, and I hope you go and spread them wherever you find yourself in the world, because Jay would just so love to still travel. But also, the people that helped me pack these seeds, the crazy little ladies evening we had was with Donna, my friend, dear Donna Agajanian, who designed the program as well as helped pack the seeds and is my rock and my stability, my guidance always in my life, and was my maid of honor in my wedding. My dear friend Leslie Rutledge, who's here, who flew in from LA just to help out, who's my long distance best friend, where I used to live in LA for years. Andrea, oh my God, who has been our dog's angel. I don't know what I would have done without her. You have no idea what she has done for Rolleiflex, our last dog, or Jay's last dog. And to Suzanne Nicholas, who works at ICP, my guardian angel from my very heart. By my very beginnings at ICP, she hired me as an adjunct, she hired me on staff along with Phil Block, and has just been there. And she made this all possible tonight here at ICP. She orchestrated the whole thing. And Jay's oldest best friend, girlfriend, Janet Zweig, who you just heard from earlier, Jay and I both said we both should have married Janet Zweig. She's the girl. And of course, everyone who sent the random pics that came from email and snail mail and all different vehicles of Facebook and craziness that made this sort of badly pixelated pair. If you're out there, oh my God, I'm embarrassed. Slideshow of his life and of his photographs, which are all copies of his beautiful black and white prints, because there were no scans, there's no digital files of anything. You have to go back old school to know Jay. So, and also to my doorkeepers on Bank Street, where we lived and who watched over Jay for so long, and even when he teetered, were his friends that were there for him. And also, just to name some names, but Lou and Sue, and Louie and Jane, Vicky and Billy, Keith and Betsy, and cousin Julie, oh my gosh, who's here tonight with her mother very ill in Florida, and who's incredible. Just for her to be here tonight is so amazing. And her husband, Bruce, I thank her for coming. And they shared the same birthday and spent almost every single birthday together in their whole time together. 10 years apart, as you saw in the pictures. So, indeed, when you marry in life, much has happened that you may not need know, or perhaps you should listen harder. It doesn't change love, but makes you know more, or sometimes it's less. And so I have a few notes from friends that I'd like to read. Danny Lyon was a good friend, and he couldn't be here. And he wrote to me, and he wanted me to make sure that I read this. He said, in 1980, I lived with the family on Christie Street. If you know Danny Lyon's work, you'll know what the family is. The city was bankrupt, buildings abandoned, cars exploded in the streets, fires and shootings were common. I don't think I could have survived those times without two people, Jay Manis and Marty the Seltzer Man. Marty the Seltzer Man delivered. Jay Manis didn't. I think we know what that means. He asked if he could say that. I would walk over to Jay's place, up the crooked stairs, just walk up a couple of tiny rooms above East 3rd Street. Jay always had a twinkle in his eye, a Leica close by, and those glasses in front of his formidable brain. Goodbye, Jay. Thanks for all the happiness you gave me and all of us, Nancy and Danny Lyon. I also asked Hank Wessel actually to speak tonight. And they were very good friends when he was in town and staying with Lou and Sue. And he wrote to me a few weeks before he died in his sleep, explaining that his illness would keep him from traveling at this time, but he had great hope. And that day, Hank searched and was determined to find a negative. And he found the negative and he scanned it, And he sent me the picture you see in the program of Jay on a boxcar in a freight train. Kind of amazing. The photograph was taken while I was living in a converted boxcar in Glorieta, New Mexico in the early 70s. He said, Hank, we hopped a freight when it stopped to pick up cars just for the hell of it, rode through the incredible undeveloped landscape of northeast New Mexico. Although I won't make the memorial, I'd like to say a few words from my friend Jay. He was the kindest, gentlest, sweetest friend. If I hear kindest, gentle one more time, I guess he really was. But we all had weaknesses, and so did Jay. But he was devoted to his friends, his dogs, his wife, and his work and students. I knew him many years and loved him, was lucky to have a friend like him. I always asked for and followed his recommendations for books to read, books that enriched my life. Everyone who knew Jay will miss him. I will miss him. Good times, good thoughts out to you. Sorry I can't be there. Sorry, because it's Hank as well passing as Jay. Okay, so next I'd like to read what Jay wrote in regard to his exhibition in Lima. It's called Soft Stones and Hard Culture. So he wrote and he read at the exhibition. In the summer of 2001, I spent the summer photographing in Peru. In my darkroom, I look at pictures of broken stones, and I think I hear echoes of the destruction of powerful lost civilizations. Weeks later in New York on 9/11, I watch iconic buildings explode from my rooftop and disappear from the skyline. What I see is simultaneously horrible and beautiful, natural and extraordinary, as creation is. Death is. Extinction is. People who were privileged to live before that morning were people who didn't notice that they had been living in paradise all this time. That day was the start of the new millennium and the 21st century for me. It was clear metaphorically and physically. Past civilization and culture being transformed into an unknown future. Later, wanting to observe something about my own civilization and culture as it slips away, I found details so small and insignificant surviving this fragile world, shards broken off the many complex and wondrous pyramids we build and we lose in our own time. So I want to also read something Jay wrote about meeting Robert Frank. And it was for a piece for an upcoming book that someone's doing. And he said, I'm sorry, that he had just completed working Robert on me and my brother. And he said, I had the luck and the revelatory experience of being exposed to someone who represented a startling way of being a photographer. At the construction of the weekend, photographic lightning continued to strike as I hitchhiked a common late 60s mode of transportation north. Robert and June Leaf, on their way to Chicago, quickly picked me up. We were on the road through America together. So he just met June and Robert. He got picked up by them. He had no idea really who Robert was, and they drove across country, across America together. So there are certain moments in your life that are our private destiny, but recognizing that significance in the moment is not always possible, even though it's being seared into your brain for life. Today, I face that. I deliberated whether to speak at all, but I felt since this institution was gracious enough to lend us this space, and given that my entire marriage was framed within these 18 years. I worked here and loved this place so much. I felt honored bound to Jay and myself and our legacy as photo mavens to speak in his behalf in this last great hall of tribute. He loved ICP. He loved all the versions of ICP, all the museums it's been. And he so looked forward to Essex Street, where we're moving to, because That's where we met. Kind of funny, but that's where we actually met. So, yes, I did love Jay Manis, Harold J. Manis, and very much. And yes, I'll always miss him. But the process of grieving has been difficult in significant ways in these months. Losing your floor literally and figuratively at the same time has been excruciating. It is certainly one thing to look and teach photojournalism, but it's another to walk the walk yourself. So pardon my petty pity factor. For others live greater sorrows than I. There is no comparison, and I dare not make one today. But how I found healing was, by coincidence, a task I had dreaded and avoided for years. I wanted to show his work to you because he's never published a book. No one could really define his work. And in fact, when I met Robert Frank for the first time, he looked up at me and he said, "Finally, the right wife, an editor." Wasn't quite what I was expecting to hear. Oh my God, he married me because I was an editor. Wasn't stupid. He used every camera format there is and lost countless ones. He was always losing his phone as well. And so prudently, he never took an iPhone image, ever. He once dropped a phone in the sewer, and a New York crew specifically tasked with cell phone retrieval in New York City arrived. He found them, and they came and they dug the phone out of the sewer for him. And Ed's story, I'm going to elaborate on a little bit because it is extremely funny. He once double parked his car in front of 3rd Street for a minute, quote unquote, a minute, and came out to find it stolen. But Jay was nothing if not resourceful. He hopped on his bike and drove around, convinced that the thief had little time to go far. Victory. It was parked in front of a deli. He used his second key. Always, always carry a second key. Always. And so he got in his car, he drove it home, and what he always chuckled about was missing the expression on the thief's face when he came back to his stolen car, stolen. Jay's sense of fairness, bartering, an eye for an eye was deep within him. Easily distracted, loathing openings and idiotic pleasantries. He was always parking the car, getting the car, or whatever. Ronavi would always say, "Jay parking the car again?" at an ICP opening. He'd say, "Missing the moment." But what I found by going through his photographs, and the good part of all of this, is that it was a life well lived. He was in love with love and forged forward time after time, convinced to conquer. He used this process of love and pain in his work. And by that, I mean he found old historical postcards, and rather than putting their pretty pictures together, he looked at the messages of what people were writing to each other through 100 years of snail mail. There was nothing slower than a postcard arrival. This was his thesis at VSW. He studied with Frank. He made some movies with him. He was at the clubs, and he met many famous people and even photographed some of them and was there when Robert shot Cocksucker Blues with the Rolling Stones and all of those big deal things. But at the heart, he was struggling to find how to put his collectibles into his art. Our friend said his work was more about process than the imagery itself, taking pictures so he could go in the darkroom and develop them and print them and then layer them on top of each other and cut them up in pieces and put them together in some grand experimentation. Part science, part history, melding two loves together to place ephemera in a historical context, the history of life, and his perspective for the future, and personally for himself to make it explain the past somehow, explain the past and the present, and one day maybe into the future. He was a voracious reader of history and science fiction, past, future, but no real present. He was a true Renaissance man. He thought only about the future in the context of automaton robots and creatures from another planet and crazy things coming down from the sky like I don't know, warlords, dictators taking over America by right-wing fanaticism of untrue facts and attacks against the media that he saw in science fiction years ago, and Nazi-like symbolism that paralleled it, and the disintegration of humanity. He was a cynic. He earned that right. But at heart, he wanted to go home and to come in from the cold, as a song on the back of your program says. He idolized his mom as a good Jewish boy should. She died some 40 years ago. But we would joke about Celia and Betty and how they would have kiboshed the Jewish Catholic marriage some 50 years ago, and now smile from heaven as their recipes are shared. One should never edit their partner's work. I knew that from the start, and I avoided it as much as I could. I certainly was editing everyone else's work at ICP, all my students, and every photographer who knocked on my door and wanted me to make a book out of something or nothing, and I spent all that time doing that. But I was afraid to look at his work. I was afraid of hurting his feelings, exhausted from working so hard. It's hard to edit. Afraid of saying no and yes and no and no, yes and no and no. And so it's easier now to edit his work, but it's harder because there are no captions. As Beth Flynn, who might be here tonight, said to me, of course he left no captions. He's a photographer. There's no captions. There's no identifications. There's nothing. It's a guessing game. It's a guessing game to organize, and what it's done is make me struggle and search and soulfully consider this man and what he was trying to say. And what I found is a very sweet, a very intelligent and articulate man. Gentle, of course, he was, and who really loved to love. He loved to give. He loved to find things on the street to photograph and to collect or to give away. He collected stamps and marbles and baseball cards and ephemera of everything. I never got a first-hand present, a brand new present. I got second-hand presents. I got this ring is from the street on my birthday. He screwed up. He forgot the birthday. He went out. I literally, a half an hour later, he comes back. He finds this. I think it's Annie Leibowitz's because it was in front of her house. Sorry, Annie. But he collected magazines and books and lamps and shades and toys and gave toys to my kids in the building and toys to other people. He collected Hess trucks for 50 years. I got 50 years of Hess trucks. Anyone wants them, come see me later. I never received a Hallmark card from him ever. He either made it or he found one in a junk shop to give me. And I was sort of frustrated, I suppose, by that fact, not loving it enough. But he was a son of a junk dealer, always trying to salvage all he found as well as his own life. He always felt lucky in that way. And he was eccentric. He often thought about how much hair he had lost and how he had cut off and what it might have piled up to be if he'd kept it in a jar. He was mesmerized by the obsolete. And even though we had this tiny apartment, we managed to stuff so much stuff into it. We also stuffed a lot of life into it. We did laugh a lot. His humor was so cutting as his mind. We enjoyed all our trips, often while teaching, enjoying the comfort of strangers in their homes in different places. He wasn't much for restaurants, and so I became a cooking queen. He was always appreciative. We squeezed a lot of life out of these 14 years. But aging through the digital age has a cost. He lost his darkroom. He lost teaching darkroom. And he never mastered Lightroom. Or in fact, the computer, really. It became depressing for him, and so he stopped taking pictures. He said, why bother when you can't really print them? One of the last things he said to me when I gave him a new camera for our trip to Torino, and he shot his first pictures in years, was, now I remember why I take pictures, because within the act itself, there is total focus. There's no loss. There's no gain. It's just a peace and peaceful obsession. I do know that we were the happiest we've been in years when we were in Torino. It was a magical time because he was so calm and so happy at just being in a quiet place, aimlessly wandering, no agenda. A place he found majestically humble, not trying to show itself off, yet grand. And that's the kind of guy he actually was. So thank you And I'd like to invite anyone who would like to come up and share any Jay stories, funny or sad, all both are allowed. So thank you. Keith, thank you.
I'm Keith Bendis. I'm an illustrator. I met Jay at an opening in the early 80s. Two Jewish boys from the Midwest trying to make it in New York. We became fast friends. And we hung out. I think what was particular about Jay was he was so easy to hang with. He didn't make value judgments. He was my confidant. I knew whatever I told him wouldn't go past us. He was also, it hasn't been said, but I think a great dope dealer. He had the best weed in New York. Once, Jay had no compunction to get in his beat-to-shit car and go into Midtown in the middle of the week to make a delivery. He said, "You want to go?" I said, "Yeah, let's go." So we pull up in front of one of the theaters on Broadway. He makes a call. Out comes this well-dressed executive. "Hey, Jay, how you doing?" Get in the back. And made the deal. And I said, "How do you fucking know this guy?" He said, "I don't know, I just know him." And I did that a lot with him. It was just fun. But he didn't really partake. He liked the process. I don't know how many clients he had, but it was definitely a part of Jay. I called Jay every Monday morning just to get my brain working. I'm a freelance illustrator in my little studio in the country. And go, "What's going on, man?" And we find bullshit to go through for about 20 minutes. And okay, and I did that for years and years. I just loved talking to the guy. So I'll miss Jay. He was a good friend. He was probably one of my best friends. So, thank you.
I just want to say a few words. I'm Dolly, Jay's younger sister. Actually, his older sister. And I remember the day Jay was born. First of all, Jay came into a family of two siblings with my brother Bob, who was 10 years older. Raise your hand, Bob. And myself, and I was 7 years older than Jay. But I just want to tell you, we were the two worst kids you can ever imagine. We fought from morning to night, and we just ran that house like there were no parents in that house. We didn't care what anyone said. We just did what we wanted. So on the day that Jay was going to be born, everybody, of course, was very excited. Bob wanted a boy. I wanted a girl. Bob, being the oldest and the most spoiled kid, he got what he wanted. He got a baby brother. And of course, I was very disappointed. But I want to tell you, the minute that kid came home from the hospital, we, of course, just all adored him. And not only that, there was a peacefulness in the house. The house sort of calmed down. And this child, as he grew, I used to take care of him until maybe he was 5 years old every summer and went and took him places. But he was just very peaceful. He was good. His favorite cowboy was Hopalong Cassidy, and he would play Hopalong Cassidy. But he also, even as a very young child, cared about our parents. He always made sure they were okay. and that everybody was okay. And he continued this on into school. And even as he grew older, of course, his finances were never terrific, but he would come and visit me, and I had 4 children. And there was not one single time that he came to that house that he didn't bring something, maybe a bag of marbles or a toy truck that he had, but it was something. He never, ever forgot to bring them anything. And the kids always remembered that. And he continued this as he got older and we got older. And I just want to say, until the very end, he still was very, very, as they say, kind and gentle. And the only thing I can say, he was just on this planet a very short time, too short of a time. He was an amazing artist, and hopefully wherever he is, there will be peace. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Louis of Jane and Louis fame. Allison suggested that I tell a funny story about Jay. In the past couple of years, there were no funny stories about Jay. Prior to that, they were all funny. What I remember, I've known Jay quite some time. What I remember is we would hang out together quite a bit. And then as time passed, we hung out less, but I remember Jay in my head. Jay was my rabbi. Jay would comment on things in my head. I'd say, Jay, what do you think of that? What about her? What about this? And Jay would comment. And then what happened is Jay died. And I realized I still talked about Jay in my head. Jay still commented on things. And so I'm remembering now, Jay never died fully for me. Jay is still there in my head, and I think he will be for the rest of my life. Thank you.
This is so awful and wonderful at the same time. I'm getting up here to talk only because I know I would regret it later if I didn't say a few words about my long friendship with Jay. I met Jay in the late 70s, or it may have been the very early 80s. We were working at an ad agency where I certainly didn't fit in, and there was Jay. We became friends really quickly, especially after I was out sick, and I came in one day and there was blood all over the wall, the white wall of this ad agency, and Jay evidently we were always switching desks. Anyway, he had a desk that faced the wall, and he had reached for his X-Acto knife and severed an artery. So when I came back, there was the blood all over the place. It was a really terrible time in my life, and aside from the blood, but it was a really terrible time in my life. And Jay and I became friends really, really quickly and stayed friends for a very long time. I would spend, I think it was, those were the days when I would walk around crying a lot. But with Jay, I walked around talking and laughing. He really made me laugh. And we spent many long nights. The Kiev was open all night, so we would be there having pierogies and blintzes at like 4 o'clock in the morning, having a philosophical discussion. And I loved that I could always talk about, I was a visual artist back then. I'm a writer now, but I could always talk about anything. And he was always game, and we just talked for hours and hours. We fell out of contact for a couple of years when he married his first wife, Trixie. But then we became friends again, active friends, and Jay loved sharing his friends with me. So he introduced his friends and loved ones. So he introduced me to Louis, who first, I think, and to Julie, who he loved, and he wanted us to be friends. And so he introduced me to wonderful Julie, and I met her tailless or hairless cat, whatever, in the tiniest apartment in New York. And Louis, and then Allison, do you remember when we met? Because I remember when we met. No, that was later. We met at the, at Roseland. And Jay was out on a date with Allison, and it was like a blues dance night. And he was so, I could see this big change in Jay. He was so happy to be with Allison. And I did, huh? And that place no longer exists, right? But, oh yeah, so just a couple of things that I have to reiterate. Kind and gentle and sweet. When he was younger, he reminded me of Bud Cort. He had these long legs and that sort of round face, and also, oh yeah, the constant smell of like cigarette smoke and all sorts of smoke and around Jay. But he never forgot my birthday. My birthday is, there's a little thing about it. I was March 4th, so it was always, what did the general say to his troops? So that lodged in his head, and I would always get one of those postcards with the cut up photos that, happy birthday and the cut up photos on it, and also these are the birthday presents that are still somewhere in the apartment I've lived in since I was 19. Marbles, a kaleidoscope, ball and jacks, and a lighter from a thrift shop, like one of those types of lighters, like a Zippo that had a black cat on it, and the initials ML, my initials. Anyway, I can't believe he's gone. And the last thing I want to say is that Jay was a true artist. He did not want to be famous. He just wanted to take pictures. And he loved art, and he had a great eye and a great heart and a great mind, and I will miss him. I do miss him.
Hi, I'm Julie Manis, and Jay was my twin cousin. I was born on his 10th birthday. Both our mothers were named Betty Manis. We were both the youngest of 3. We were both named after our father's Uncle Harry, my Hebrew name, thank God, but he, had Harold. All along while I was growing up, he always remembered my birthday, his birthday. He would make me these homemade cards. Later, when I went to school, I found out later he had gone to Gainesville for a while like I did. I didn't know when I went there. When I took my mom to Peru and came back and told him about this great little bed and breakfast we stayed at, turned out Jay had stayed there in this whole country, the same place. And when I decided I was going to move to Chicago, I went to Chicago. I found a job in a couple of days. And so I thought, well, I'll go visit my cousin Jay in New York. I never moved to Chicago. And Jay taught me that you can have a really nice life in New York on very little money. And it was a lesson that I probably shouldn't have taken so much to heart, but I did. He taught me all these great places to go. When I moved here, he just showed me the town. He brought me to parties like I had never been to in my life. He taught me all these great little cheap places to eat. He just took me into his life, and it was great. I don't think too many people move to this city and have such a full and wonderful welcome and orientation. So I thought I would share something with you that even Jay didn't know, and even his own brother and sister don't know, and that's among my 2 brothers and I. By the way, we were both the youngest of 3. Among my 2 brothers and I, we had a nickname for Jay. As you know, his real name was Harold. And growing up in Fond du Lac, Wisconsin, my brothers and I would get up early in the morning. On Sunday mornings, there was nothing on TV, but there was a show, a religious show, We never really watched the show, but we loved the name. It was called Herald of Truth. And for years, my brothers, and still when I talk to my brothers, they refer to him as Herald of Truth. And now listening to all this tonight, I realized that it was a good name for him.
Yeah, okay, hi. Yeah, I don't prepare anything, but I think I can add something that y'all might have not heard. Because I'm 22, and the rest of y'all know Jay from the 70s and the 80s in New York, apparently. But, you know, he like kind of helped raise me at a time where I needed someone like that in my life, and he would change SpongeBob to South Park and do all types of funny stuff like that. So like you might remember him as kind and gentle, but he was also kind of rough at certain times too. Pretty funny. I saw a movie with him in the theaters once. It's pretty shitty, but I liked it. And I asked him how he felt about it, and he said that it was bad. And he kind of laughed. But at a young age, that actually really did help set me in a very specific artistic direction.
I love it.
And since I figure I got a lot more years in the rest of my life, and I will carry that piece of Jay with me till then. So hopefully 2080s, he'll still be living with me there. I hope you guys also have a good evening.
Hi, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Perez, and I sang at Jay and Allison's wedding. And I fell in love with them as a couple. And listening to everything tonight it's just amazing. The love and the respect in the room. So my gift is a song. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I found. Was blind, but now I see. 'Twas grace that taught my heart to fear, and grace my fears released. How precious did that grace appear the hour I first believed. My chains are gone, I've been set free. My God, my Savior has rescued me. Like a flood, His mercy reigns, forever loved. Amazing grace, forever loved. Amazing grace. Amen.
I think we could go on, and I just want to thank Diana so much, because in the middle of all my shit, Diana's husband passed away as well. So it was very sweet of her to come tonight and sing that for us. Thank you, Diana. God bless. Okay, so it's like really sad. So I think we need a drink and a little something to eat, and there's lots to share, and I hope it's still good and bad, good and funny stories, and bad and sad. I don't care, but they're good stories, and I want to hear them forever. and write them in the guest book by the door and write them all over the place because I want to put pictures in there besides. It doesn't have to be all just signatures. And then also, of course, I may have said it, I don't know, but the seed packets I made with my girlfriends are sunflower seeds. Go spread them all over the place, wherever you go. Take more than one, and if you go to Europe or someplace, throw them out there. God bless. Thank you so much for coming. Have a drink. This is his photographs with his music.